Good morning, everyone. You want to please take your seats. And we have today the hearing loop in the room. So if you have a telecoil, put on your telecoil. We have real-time captioning. Thank you to our captioner, Tammy. And we have sign language. We have full communication access for anyone who would need it. I'm Barbara Kelly. I'm the Executive Director of the Hearing Loss Association of America. And welcome to the 2022 HLAA Research Symposium, Cochlear Implants, What's New, What's Next? Today we'll be talking about cochlear implants, which, as many of you know, are an increasingly popular treatment option for people with hearing loss. Cochlear implants are more powerful, more technologically sophisticated, and are an appropriate option for an increasing number of us. And yet, many people who could benefit from a cochlear implant haven't yet made the decision to get one. This symposium is meant to help inform you about where you might fit in the spectrum of potential cochlear implant recipients, and to bring you up to date on scientific developments in the field. Since 1994, each HLAA convention has featured a research symposium that covers cutting-edge scientific findings relevant to adults with hearing loss. 3 years ago, we were fortunate to secure funding for the symposia from the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders at the National Institutes of Health. That support has enabled us to create videos of the symposia and these scientific talks and circulate them to a wider community of people with hearing loss who are unable to attend this convention and who could benefit from hearing accessible videos with captioning and sign language interpreting. This is a unique resource for our community, and we are grateful for the NIDCD support. I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Christine Dinh, who is the moderator for today's symposium. Dr. Dinh is an associate professor of otolaryngology at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. She's an active clinician as well as a seasoned researcher. We are delighted to have Dr. Dinh with us today. Dr. Dinh will introduce our panel, and I encourage you to read their bios in your program today and enjoy the symposium. And thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Good morning, everybody, on this wonderful Friday morning in Tampa Bay, Florida. It's wonderful to see all of you in the crowd today. So I will be talking about cochlear implants, what's new, what's next, and thank you, Barbara, for the amazing introduction. I am an associate professor from the University of Miami, and I'm passionate about treating patients with hearing loss and cochlear implants. I have no relevant financial disclosures. So I'm going to first start off with an introduction. What is a cochlear implant? Who is it for? What does the process entail? Why is it so great? And then we're going to delve into a series of presentations from our panelists talking about how language and disparities can affect access to cochlear implants and outcomes with the cochlear implant. The impact of age on our ability to hear with cochlear implants, and then finally end with a talk about residual hearing. How do we save the natural hearing that we have during and after cochlear implant surgery? Then I'll invite our panelists up here to answer a couple of questions that we generally hear from our patients that are looking into getting a cochlear implant and are trying to make the decision for themselves. So I'm going to start off with, what is a cochlear implant? A cochlear implant is a surgically implanted electronic device that can restore hearing to people with severe to profound hearing loss. There are two parts, an external part that sits outside of the ear, and then an internal part where the surgeon implants underneath the skin behind the ear. The external device has an ear hook, a speech processor, and a battery, and that allows the external processor to sit on the ear. It also has a microphone that picks up sound from that side of the head and then transmits it to the speech processor that processes the sound and sends it to the transmitter coil. And when the magnet of the external device lines up with the magnet of the internal device, a signal can be transmitted to the internal device to the receiving antenna. That signal is then sent to the receiver stimulus that converts the signal into a series of electrical impulses that travel down the cochlear implant wire to the electrode array, which has a series of metal contacts that delivers the electricity to the auditory nerve and allows us to hear. So who is it for? Well, sound normally enters into the ear canal, hits the eardrum, and the eardrum vibrates. And once the eardrum vibrates, the three bones behind it vibrate and sends a signal into the cochlea and stimulates the auditory hair cells to deliver an electrical signal that is transmitted through the cochlear nerve to the brain so that way we can hear. But sometimes our auditory hair cells are not functioning well, and the signal that is sent from the cochlea is not as strong. And when that happens, patients can't hear as well, and that's called sensory neural hearing loss. So what you see here in this slide is a plot of an audiogram where we put the results of a conventional hearing test. From left to right, we plot low pitches to high pitches or frequencies, and from up to down, we plot good hearing to poor hearing. And a traditional cochlear implant candidate has moderate to profound sensory neural hearing loss, as you can see toward the bottom of the plot in green. And when this type of hearing loss starts to affect our ability to understand speech, a hearing aid may not work as well to restore hearing. Sometimes the hearing gets poor enough that our ability to understand speech declines significantly and declines to a point where it's less than 50% on the implanted side, or the worst ear. It can also decline in the other ear to a point where a patient may only be understanding up to 60% of the words going into that ear, or 60% in both ears. And when that happens, patients with hearing loss are a candidate for cochlear implants. And we know from a lot of research over the years that traditional cochlear implant candidates do very well with cochlear implants. In a study that we did at the University of Miami, we looked at our traditional cochlear implant candidates that got only one implant, and we followed them over time, over the next 24 months after surgery. And we found out right before the surgery, they start off with about 10% understanding of the words and sentences that we give them, but after a cochlear implant, they actually do very well. They can achieve an average of 60% word understanding on the CNC word test in quiet, and that's really a great score because the CNC word test is a very difficult test to perform well in. In addition, when we test them with AZ Biosentences, a test that tests sentence understanding, our traditional cochlear implant patients do even better, understanding on average 75% of the sentences that we present to them. And in my experiences, some of my patients get up to 100% on both sides, with the CNC words and the AZ bio sentences if they work toward that, which is amazing. And our research is in line with other institutions like the University of Pennsylvania that looked at their experiences with their traditional cochlear implant candidates. And they found that their patients are able to achieve on average 50% word understanding with the CNC word test and up to 75% understanding on the AZ bio sentence test. And these results are really consistent across the entire nation, going from 10% word understanding or sentence understanding to 75% is really remarkable. Who else is it for? People with single-sided deafness are also candidates for cochlear implants as well. What is single-sided deafness? In a person with single-sided deafness, they have really profound hearing loss on one side. But on the other side, they have relatively normal or maybe just a little bit of mild hearing loss. And in a quiet environment, face-to-face, when you talk to them, they're actually doing very well, understanding 100% of the things that are being said to them because they have really one good ear. But as soon as multiple people are talking, as soon as they step back into an area where there's a lot of background noise, they decompensate because they can't localize sound or understand speech and noise. And so if we can restore their hearing in their bad ear, we can really give them a lot of good quality of life and speech understanding in more difficult situations. People with asymmetric hearing loss can also benefit from cochlear implants too. They are very similar to single-sided deafness patients in that they have really profound hearing loss on one side. And the other side, they have maybe a little bit worse of a hearing loss, and that usually ranges from mild to moderate severe hearing loss. And if I put a hearing aid on their better ear, same thing. They can hear me very well in a quiet environment. But as soon as there are multiple people talking to them, as soon as there's noise in the environment, they decompensate and they can't hear very well. So providing them a cochlear implant may really help them in their day-to-day lives. Sometimes we can give them a cross hearing aid. A cross hearing aid is a pair of hearing aids, and when somebody talks to them on their worst ear, the microphone picks it up, sends the signal to the good ear, so the good ear is actually hearing from both sides of the head. But that technology is not perfect because you're still hearing from one ear. It's not stereo sound like you're hearing from both ears. And so when you don't benefit from a regular hearing aid and you don't benefit from a cross hearing aid, that's when a cochlear implant can really be very beneficial. So several studies have looked at people with single-sided deafness to see how they perform with cochlear implants, and they do just as well as our traditional cochlear implant patients. They achieve a median of 60% by 1 year, which is amazing because this test is in general a very difficult test to do well on. In our study at the University of Miami, where we looked at all of our single-sided deafness patients and asymmetric hearing loss patients, and we followed them with time, we are able to really improve their ability to hear words and sentences. And they score an average of 65% on the CNC word test with time. And they score up to 85% on the AZ bio sentence test. And these are remarkable. They're slightly better than what we see in our patients with traditional cochlear implants, but it takes them just a little bit longer to get to their maximum scores, because in people with single-sided deafness and asymmetric hearing loss, they need to learn how to use the cochlear implant, but they also need to learn how to integrate normal sound from their good ear and electrical hearing from their other ear. But if they work at it, they can achieve amazing outcomes. There are other benefits to restoring hearing on the side that is deaf. So, for example, people with single-sided deafness and asymmetric hearing loss, when they go from hearing from one ear to hearing in both ears, they get better speech understanding and noise. They can localize sound better. They have less listening effort, which results in less social isolation and improved quality of life. Our patients are very happy. So who else is a candidate for cochlear implants? Hybrid cochlear implant candidates are a very special group because they have really good hearing in the low frequencies, but they have very poor hearing in the mid to high frequencies. And generally, patients that have this profile of hearing loss generally have the same profile in both ears. But this type of hearing loss can, over time, affect a person's ability to understand words and speech. And when it starts doing that, patients may be a candidate for what we call a hybrid cochlear implant system. So, what is a hybrid cochlear implant system? During surgery, if we're able to preserve the low frequencies, we can give a patient a hearing aid to amplify the low frequencies and a special hybrid cochlear implant to restore hearing in the mid to high frequencies. So in this system, a patient is using both a hearing aid and a cochlear implant on the same ear to be able to hear. And that's called electroacoustic hearing. Several studies have shown that we are able to save that residual hearing in approximately 50% of patients. But regardless of whether we're able to save that low frequency residual hearing or not, our patients actually do very well. They score on average 50% on the CNC word test, which I told you before is a difficult test to do well in. But what's special about the hybrid CI system is that it has some additional benefits if you can hear with both the hearing aid and a cochlear implant. Some studies have shown that they can hear better in a noisy environment and they can discern pitch better. And that's important for music, that's important for understanding tonal languages. And there's been lots of studies now in children and adolescents that are really confirming all these amazing benefits of the hybrid cochlear implant system, and studies are ongoing to really see what all of the benefits are for a hybrid cochlear implant. So we've talked about kind of like the three big categories of patients that are candidates for cochlear implants. So what does that process entail? So you'll visit your ENT doctor. Your ENT doctor will assess you, order appropriate hearing tests, imaging, laboratory tests. You'll then go to see your audiologist who will perform the hearing tests and fit you with appropriate hearing aids if you haven't gotten them already. And after you get all of your tests done, your ENT doctor will then review those results with you and determine whether your ear can be surgically implanted with the cochlear implant. And if it is, then you'll see your audiologist again, who will perform additional hearing tests to determine if you are a cochlear implant candidate. And if you are, then your ENT physician will then discuss the details of the surgery with you, and with the help of your team, you will decide which implant company to go with. Currently, there are 3 companies in the United States that you can choose from. In the future, there may be more. But when you decide you want to do a cochlear implant, your ENT physician will bring you to the operating room and perform the cochlear implant surgery, which takes about 1 to 2 hours on average. You'll wake up with a big head dressing on just to cover the ear that was implanted, and you go home the same day. Then in a few days, you'll come back to your ENT physician to ensure that the ear is healed before your audiologist activates the cochlear implant. At most institutions, we activate the implant around 2 to 4 weeks after the surgery. And then you're going to be working with your audiologist and your audioverbal therapist to gain speech understanding with your implant. So now we've talked about what is a cochlear implant, who is a candidate for it, the amazing speech understanding benefits that you can get with the cochlear implant, but it's not the same unless you hear it from somebody who has gone through the process of dealing with their hearing loss, that has gone through many different pairs of hearing aids and ultimately decided to do a cochlear implant. And I want to share Roxana Rotundo's story. She's a member of the HLAA Board of Directors, and I hope you enjoy it. This little clip comes from a documentary that she produced called We Hear You. We pulled a couple of clips from it. It's in Spanish, but you can see the captions are in English. I hope you enjoyed the clip. Can we please play the movie?
La primera vez comenzó hace aproximadamente unos 15 años, fue muy leve. Por mucho tiempo no afectó mi vida porque solamente había perdido esa frecuencia auditiva, que era una frecuencia aguda muy particular que me permitía seguir funcionando a excepción de escuchar ese sonido. Y a partir de ese momento, hace más de 15 años ya, comenzó lo que se llama un Progressive Hearing Loss, una pérdida auditiva progresiva que se fue empeorando a través de los cosas más difíciles de entender con el implante, que seguimos siendo sordos, inclusive más sordos que cuando nos hicimos el implante. Entonces básicamente cuando tienes el procesador externo, que es lo que usas cuando te lo quitas para dormir, pero solo escuchas en el minuto en que yo lo pego al magneto que está dentro de mi cabeza. Si yo quito ambos aparatos, estoy completamente sorda. En el momento que los pego nuevamente a lo que es el electrodo interno, es que puedo escuchar. No es que volvemos a escuchar, simplemente que es un mecanismo digital que le permite al nervio auditivo escuchar sin que el sonido pase a través del oído. Para calificar un implante coclear tienes que atender lo que se llama una sordera extrema. Y durante los 8 años que la perdí empeorando, ya yo era candidato a un implante coclear. Lo que pasa es que durante el proceso te dicen que ese poco que te queda, ese 30% que te queda ahí, del cual tú estás escuchando, lo más probable es que lo pierdas durante la operación. Entonces, you don't want to, como se dice en inglés, you don't want to let go ese poquito que te queda, aunque ese poco no te sirva para nada. Es una operación donde mentalmente tienes que estar muy tranquila, porque la operación es lo más fácil del proceso, es todo lo que viene después de la operación. Ese momento en que prenden ese electrodo y tú dices, el nervio reaccionó y voy a aprender a escuchar otra vez. Lo primero que escuché y fue la voz de mi hermana el día de la activación, y ella tiene la voz más aguda que te puedes imaginar, lo que es una voz high frequency. Entonces cuando ella habló el día de la activación, era una de las voces que yo había perdido hacía ya muchos años. Esa poquita frecuencia que ella dijo, funcionó. Esa es la pregunta que tú le haces al médico, ¿funcionó? Y yo escuché el final, o no. Pero fue una emoción de decir, wow, tengo 15 años que no escucho esta frecuencia. Y eso nunca lo voy a olvidar porque era la voz más importante para mí escuchar en la vida, la que yo había perdido. Mi sobrina que tiene 17 años, mi pérdida auditiva comenzó desde que ella nació. Entonces ella se aprendió de una manera natural a hablarme a mí de una forma que era la única persona que yo le escuchaba todo el tiempo. Hace poco estaba realizando su essay, un trabajo que hizo para la universidad, para entrar a la universidad, y una de las frases que puso que me llegó a mi corazón fue: tengo mejor comunicación con mi tía sorda que con todo el mundo con quien estoy rodeado, que escucha perfecto. Sino es una persona que tiene una conciencia total y absoluta de cómo hablarle a alguien para que entienda cuando no tiene audición. Pero es algo que a ella le ha salido de una manera natural. Te ponen el implante, tú vas a identificar sonidos que no sabes qué son. Entonces ella me decía, eso es un avión, eso es un camión, y ella me ayudaba a identificar los sonidos para yo aprender otra vez esa nueva forma de escuchar. Como ejemplo de que nuestro cerebro es como un disco duro. En ese disco duro están todas las voces de las personas que yo escuchaba durante mi vida en que podía escuchar bien. En el momento en que eres implantada y te activan, es como que tu cerebro, al escuchar a esa persona que había escuchado en el pasado, ¿verdad?, inmediatamente hacía la conexión y decía, esta es la voz de María, esta es la voz de Pedro, y me la ponía muy parecido a como yo la escuchaba antes. Nunca es como antes, pero es muy parecido. El segundo implante, que lo hice hace 1 año y medio, mejoró muchísimo la situación de entender voces desconocidas. La razón por la que decidí hacer un documental, hay mucha información en lo audiovisual acerca del cáncer, acerca de otras situaciones que toca vivir en la vida, pero de la pérdida auditiva no hay, y es necesario tenerlas.
Thank you so much, Roxana, for sharing this clip with us. And Roxana makes me so proud because she's done so well with her cochlear implants. But beyond that, she's a role model to many people with hearing loss, especially those that are younger, because she doesn't let her hearing loss create a glass ceiling above her head that prevents her from achieving happiness and successes in her life and her career. And getting these bilateral cochlear implants have really allowed her to do things that people probably would have never thought that she could achieve without. So thank you, Roxana. You're an amazing role model to people with hearing loss and those that don't have hearing loss as well. So why is there a reluctance to get it? And maybe some patients feel uncomfortable with having something around their ear that people can see, and the potential stigma of having hearing loss. But in a day and age where technology is at its peak, if you're not wearing an earbud, if you're not wearing an AirPod, if you're not wearing a headphone, you're actually behind the times. So this is a great time to really look into hearing aids, to really look into cochlear implants, because it is actually not a stigma to wear electronic devices around your ear. Some patients are maybe scared of some of the surgical risks. The brain is close by to the ear. The nerve that moves the face is very close by to the cochlea. But we have such amazing technology now that allows us to put in the cochlear implant with very minimal risks. And it has become one of the safest ear surgeries that we perform to date. So what are the other potential barriers to getting a cochlear implant? And we're going to talk now about how language, how geographic location, healthcare disparities, and insurance coverage may affect your access to cochlear implants and your outcomes with it. Then we're going to address misconceptions about how age may affect your ability to form with the cochlear implant. And then we're going to go into talking about different things that we do to protect the residual hearing that you may have as you're going into cochlear implant, into your cochlear implant surgery. So I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. Diane Martinez is an experienced cochlear implant audiologist who is a former assistant professor at the University of Miami, and she is so passionate about cochlear implants and treating patients with hearing loss that she is taking some time off and pursuing a doctorate of philosophy at the University of South Florida to find and develop new ways in which she can help her patients. Dr. Justin Golub is an associate professor of otolaryngology at Columbia University in New York, and he specializes in treating patients with hearing loss and with cochlear implants, and he does a lot of really groundbreaking research on patients that are older and are getting cochlear implants. Dr. Candice Hobson is an assistant professor at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and she is also an otolaryngologist that specializes in treating patients with hearing loss. She performs cochlear implant surgery, but what's special about Candice is that she is doing a lot of research on understanding the factors that prevent people from getting cochlear implants and is looking into ways in which we can overcome that. And you've already met myself. I'm an associate professor of otolaryngology at the University of Miami. I also treat patients with hearing loss, but I also do research on cochlear implant designs and different ways in which we can protect hearing or improve outcomes in patients with cochlear implants. So I'd now like to ask Diane Martinez to please come to the podium to give her talk entitled Cochlear Implants, Access and Language Considerations.
Thank you, Dr. Dinh, and thank you to the committee for having me. I have no financial disclosures, and thank you, Roxana, for that piece. It's so inspirational. I am so inspired by my patients daily. The information that I'm sharing with you all today is from a project that I worked on during my time at the University of Miami with my colleagues. And like Dr. Dinh said, yes, I am currently a second-year student, PhD student, here in Tampa at the University of South Florida. And I hope that you can take away some good information from this presentation today. So cochlear implants have been approved for adults by the FDA since 1985 and for children since 1990. However, they continue to be overwhelmingly underused, and really only about 2.8% of those who are candidates actually receive a cochlear implant. The Hispanic population tends to rise, and we are responsible for more than half of the total U.S. population growth. According to the U.S. Census, Miami, for example, has a 70% Hispanic population. And that's pretty reflective of what I had in my caseload while I was working there. I had about 70 to 75% Spanish speakers on my caseload. And so one of the biggest components, one of the important components of candidacy and tracking progress is speech perception testing. And so at the University of Miami, we had a unique opportunity to be able to take a deeper dive and look at this population because bilingual performance, there's very little known about bilingual performance. And so several years ago, one of my colleagues and I started to notice differences in the speech perception testing results of the Spanish speakers and the English speakers. And we noticed a couple things. We noticed, one, that it seemed as though that the Spanish speakers were achieving a higher percentage on their scores. And we also noticed that they seemed to be hitting those high scores earlier in the process. And so we said, well, why are we seeing such differences? And so we started taking a look at the literature, and we found a few things within comparing English and Spanish. And we found that with Spanish, there are more multisyllabic words. In English, there are more monosyllabic words. In Spanish, monosyllabic, sorry, I'm just getting my thoughts together. Monosyllabic vowels. So Spanish, going back to Spanish, sorry. In Spanish, it's more vowel heavy, and in English is very consonant heavy. And so we were wondering if maybe these differences in the speech was giving the Spanish speakers an edge. And so for our study, we took a look at a group of 85 patients, English speakers, Spanish speakers, and bilingual, English-Spanish. Of that group of 85, there were 61 English speakers and 24 English speakers. And within that big group of 85, there were 12 bilingual speakers. All these patients had hearing when they were born, but lost it over time, and they were implanted only on one side. So we proposed for our study that the Spanish speakers were going to perform better on the Spanish test than the English speakers on the English test. And we also proposed that the bilingual patients were going to perform better on the Spanish test over the English test. And that is, in fact, what happened. And so to orient you to the slide, so the Spanish speakers are indicated by the yellow line and the English speakers by the green line. In figure A, well, I should also point out that we tested in different conditions. We tested words, we tested sentences in quiet, and we did sentences in noise. And the booth was set up such that the patient is facing the speaker, and so the words and the sentences are coming from the speaker straight at the patient. When we did the sentence testing in noise, the sentences and the noise were coming from the same speaker. So if we look at figure A, on the vertical axis, we have the percent correct. So that's how many words the patients got correct. On the horizontal axis, that is, those are the different time points that we looked at. So 0 is the cochlear implant evaluation where we were determining candidacy. And that goes all the way to the more than 24-month time point. So if we look at panel A, for the word testing, not much difference between the English and the Spanish speakers. But if we look at figure B, the sentences in quiet, the Spanish speakers outperform the English speakers by about 20%. If we look at panel C, Spanish speakers once again outperform the English speakers, but this is significant, and this is by about 60%. These are the results for the bilingual speakers at the more than 24-month time point. And so for them, we looked at words in quiet and sentences in quiet. And once again, on the vertical axis, you see the percent correct. And each of the thin blue lines represents one bilingual patient. And the dark line in the middle is the average of all 12 patients. And so for the bilinguals, they scored better on the Spanish words over the English words by about 17%. And same thing over in the sentences in quiet, they scored better on the Spanish sentences versus the English sentences by 30%. So why are we seeing these differences? And we had, all these thoughts, and so we came up with a couple of things that, maybe there are different levels of proficiency in each language. At what age was a second language acquired? And for the bilingual recipients, maybe Spanish really is easier to hear or understand than English. Maybe the Spanish materials are really that much easier than the English materials. And I do have to point out that it is documented that the Spanish list that we use for this project is easier than the English sentences. However, during the time that we were taking the data, it was the only resource that we had to test our Spanish speakers. And we were just happy to start somewhere. And so finally, we also thought about maybe there are cultural differences between the Spanish and the English speakers. With the Hispanic community, the Hispanic population tends to be more communal. And maybe there are, more family members under one roof. Maybe it's a little noisier. Maybe there are more people talking over each other. Right, Roxana? Right, using the hands. And you guys saw the scores in Spanish. Maybe that's why they're scoring, that much more. I don't know. But these are some of the things we want to take a closer look at in the future. A couple of other things that we also did not analyze here. We did not look at language dominance, socioeconomic status, or education. Like I said, those are things we'd like to take a closer look at in the future. So what does this mean for me as a patient, right? Well, in a nutshell, it's important to have a nice, big, comprehensive picture of your abilities. And we can think of that in terms of candidacy, and we can think of it in terms of tracking progress. So for candidacy, we can think about, well, first I should share, at the University of Miami, we, as a group, decided that we were going to use lifestyle as a guide to sort of guide us in how to look at our testing and how to think about how we were going to submit this paperwork, these forms to the insurance. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So say we have a 70-year-old patient. They are retired, and because they're retired, maybe now they're spending more time in the home and they're speaking more Spanish in the home. Well, for this patient, because they're bilingual, we'll test them in both languages, but maybe for them, when we write the report to send to the insurance, maybe we highlight the Spanish scores. But say, for example, we have a 45-year-old who is still in the workforce, and maybe they are surrounded by more English. For them, we will again test them both in English and Spanish, but in their report, highlight their English scores and send that to the insurance. And then we can also look at, like I said, we're looking at it from the tracking progress perspective. And so I'll give you guys an example. So say we have a patient who, they come from Cuba at the age of 10, they graduate high school, they graduate college, they've now mastered the English language, they have a cochlear implant, and now they are at the 3-month time point, about to do the boot testing for the very first time to see how they're doing with the cochlear implant. And maybe their audiologist is a monolingual English speaker. And so the audiologist may say, well, my patient speaks English really well, we're just going to test them in English, which makes sense. And so they do the testing, and the patient, and this is just an example, and this is what can happen, and we've seen this happen quite often, where that patient will test in English and say at 3 months they hit 20%. At 6 months, they'll be at 25%. This is in English, right? And then at a year, they'll be at 30%. So not a whole lot of growth happening, right, on paper that you're seeing. Versus, had we tested in Spanish, in addition, maybe we would have seen 50% at 3 months, 70% at 6 months, and 90 to 100 at a year. And so it gives a nice tracking over time. And had we never tested in Spanish, we would have never known about those two scores and what this patient can do. And so very, 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 very important to have the big picture. It can help us in terms of how to counsel the patient, and it can also help to potentially lessen the frustration on the part of the patient as well, because the patient is coming in and they see 30% all the time. That they're like, wow, why do I come for testing? This is 30%. Or, again, that could lead to confusion, and they say, wow, well, it says that I'm scoring 30%, but wait, I'm doing a lot better than before I got implanted, and the family tells me that I'm doing really well. So, once again, nice to have a nice comprehensive picture. And so, since we've completed the project, there has been the release of what's called the Spanish AZ bios. These lists are proving to be more complex. They are longer in length, they have a higher vocabulary, and they're presented at a faster rate than the Spanish hints that we used for our study. And so who knows, maybe in the future, we don't have to test both the English and the Spanish. Here soon, we're going to be testing the Spanish AZ bios, comparing them to the English AZ bios with some bilingual patients. We're going to be doing this project between the University of South Florida and the University of Miami. And hopefully in the future, we'll come up with best practices and how to best manage our bilingual and Spanish speakers. Also, here in the United States, behind English and Spanish is Mandarin in terms of the most spoken languages. So hopefully this project and this work will be a platform for other bilingual groups. And so, for example, like the Mandarin speakers, the tonal language, it'll be very, very interesting to see what the outcomes are for these other bilingual groups. That's all I have for you guys today. I want to say thank you to my former team, they're still my family, at the University of Miami. I want to send a very special thank you to my colleagues and my sisters, Dr. Sandra Velandia and Dr. Christine Dinh, for their contribution to this work. I also want to say a special thank you to my advisors at the University of South Florida, Dr. Teresa Chisholm, Dr. Michelle Arnold, and Dr. Vicky Sanchez. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martinez. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Justin Golub to the podium to talk about cochlear implants and older patients.
Hello, I'm Justin Golub. I'm an associate professor of otolaryngology at Columbia University in New York. And as mentioned by Christine, I'm going to be talking about cochlear implants in older adults. And I'm well aware that I'm going to get into trouble no matter how I define older adults. So this is a view of Central Park in New York City if you're standing with your back facing Midtown Manhattan. And our medical center is located all the way at the very top of Manhattan, practically in Vermont. And here's an image of our medical center, huge, giant structure, and here's our office where I made this talk. So I'm an otologist neurotologist, meaning I'm a surgeon, I'm a cochlear implant surgeon, and I spend half my time seeing patients. And I'm also a researcher. I spend the other half of my time looking at the brain effects of age-related hearing loss. And while it looks like I'm having a lot of fun at the beach and at restaurants in these pictures, in reality, most of the time when I'm doing research, I'm just staring at 3 monitors in my office on my own in silence. So this is the outline of the talk. I'll start out with some background, and then I'll go into addressing the question of whether cochlear implantation is good in older age, and then finally, briefly, how we might improve access to this amazing technology. So I'll first start off with some background. As I think everyone here well knows, hearing loss is incredibly common. It's one of the most common conditions that affects all people. On the y-axis here is prevalence, meaning how common hearing loss is, going from 0% to everybody at 100%. And on the x-axis is age by decades of life. And you can see that as you get older, you are virtually guaranteed to get hearing loss if you live long enough. About 100% of people who are 100 have hearing loss. This slide shows the same thing in another way. On the y-axis is the amount of hearing loss you have, expressed in a threshold with the unit being decibels. And at the top here, 0 means perfect hearing, and at the bottom, 70 is severe to profound hearing loss. And on the x-axis, again, is age. And you can see as we all get older, the average hearing declines and declines. And we can draw a red line through what we often define as the border between normal and abnormal hearing. And by age 60 to 70, about half of people are below the line, meaning they have what we would usually clinically define as hearing loss. So hearing loss, very common. I'm going to skip this formula. So just to summarize the slides to this point, hearing loss is incredibly common. Over 80% of people over 80, for example. Yet at the same time, the treatment levels of hearing loss are actually very low. Under a quarter of people who are over 80 actually do anything for their hearing loss, meaning hearing aids or, if indicated, cochlear implants. And I find this disparity very noteworthy, and I know that HLAA does too, and I think it's very important to work to try to make these numbers the same number. Why does this matter? So this is an MRI of a brain, and it's a slice through the sort of the middle of the head, like how I'm pointing here. And the red rectangle is showing the inner ear structure, and the blue circle is showing the brain. And there's something that connects these two things, a nerve, the cochlear nerve, and it mostly moves in one direction, from the ear to the brain. The point of this slide is to show you that the ear is clearly important because all it really does is send signals to the brain. So if the ear isn't working good, you might think that's also not good for the brain, and this is what I'm very interested in studying, but that's not the subject of today's talk. So let's move on to the main topic. Is cochlear implantation good in older age? There are actually a lot of papers suggesting, or I should say, saying that it is good. This is one paper that looked at people who were in their 80s and 90s who had cochlear implants, and it showed that they do very well and the side effects are very low. I had to look up the word nonagenarian. I didn't actually know the meaning of that word. This is another paper by a group showing similar findings that cochlear implants in the very elderly, the outcomes are good and the side effect levels are low. And this is a paper by one of my colleagues at Columbia, Anil Lalwani, and Maura Cossetti, who's also in New York, showing the same thing, that cochlear implants in the elderly are safe and they're also effective. And I'm just going to read you a couple quotes from the abstract, the summary of this paper. They wrote, overall, current data supports a high level of perioperative, meaning around the time of surgery, and long-term safety for elderly patients undergoing cochlear implantation. And skipping to the last sentence, elderly patients benefit significantly from cochlear implantation with respect to speech outcome and quality of life. Thus, advanced age should not limit candidacy for cochlear implantation. So then my group actually did another study looking at this in a little more detail, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. This symposium is titled that this is a research symposium, so I'm actually going to present my research. I'm going to try to not make it too boring and technical. So this study used a national database that no longer exists, but it did for a number of years, called Hermes. And this was a very innovative database that basically aggregated cochlear implant outcomes information from many centers across the United States. And so very quickly, this became the largest database of cochlear implant outcomes in the United States. The outcomes that we looked at included the AZ-Bio, which is a common score of speech ability, cochlear implant usage, meaning how many hours a day are you actually wearing the device, and surgical complications. And this is where I'm going to get into trouble, but we defined older and younger using a cut point of 75 years. This is admittedly arbitrary, but most studies to date had, I see some people excited in the audience that they're below the cut point, but there are other studies that use 65 as a cut point, and I think in 2022, or at the time this study was done about 5 years ago, I think that that's not an appropriate cut point. I think many people are thriving and working into their 70s, and so one of the unique thing about this study is we raised the cut point to 75 years. A more modern definition, if you will. And the data came from 18 medical centers around the country, and it included individuals who were implanted between around 2000 and 2016. So this table here shows the difference between the two groups, between the older group, which is column 2, and the younger group, which is column 3. And the rows are certain, what we call variables or attributes we looked at. So the first 2 rows are simply the number of people or the number of ears in the study. There were about 50, quote, older people in the study and about 100, quote, younger people in the study, and similar number of ears. The third row is age. So on average, the older group was about 82 years old, and the younger group was just under 60 years old. And then the fourth row is duration of deafness in years. And the older group had deafness for about 26 years, and the younger group for around 18 years. This row, duration of deafness, is important because it introduces an analysis problem because the older people also were deaf longer. So the older people might do worse, not because they're old, but because they just have been deaf longer. They waited longer to have the cochlear implant. And those two things are different. Being old doesn't mean you wait a long time before you have a cochlear implant. And so in the analysis, which I'll show you in a few slides, we have to control for that difference between the two groups. And then here are some variables that were the same between groups. Both groups were the same in terms of their gender, in terms of their race and ethnicity, in terms of which state they came from, the side they had the surgery on, and the device company that they used. All right, this busy table basically shows you this take-home point that there were no significant differences in surgical complications between the older and the younger groups. So column 2 is the older group, column 3 is the younger group, and the rows are possible complications. And the final row on the right is what we call in statistics the p-value, and while this is not completely accurate for the purposes today, we'll just say if it's greater than 0.05, then there was no difference between the two groups. And you could see all the p-values are 0.05, so that means there were no difference in complications between the two groups. And that included the first row, which is a scary thing that luckily almost never happens in cochlear implantation, brain fluid leak. That happened pretty unlikely in both groups. The second row is injury to the nerve that does taste, the nerve called the chordotympany nerve. That was rare and the same between the two groups. The third row is a bleeding from a kind of vein that's in the head. That rarely happened. And then the bottom 3 rows are the delayed complications. Dizziness, that's a common one. That definitely happens in all ages. And it happened in about a quarter of people in both groups, but there was no significant difference between the older and younger people. Tinnitus was the same between the two groups, and wound issues like infections or the wound opening up was the same between the two groups. So some of these complications are scary, but you could see the numbers are generally all extremely low, except dizziness was a quarter, and that usually is temporary. So this slide shows the hearing performance over time comparing the two groups. On the y-axis is the hearing performance using the AZ Bio metric. So higher is better. On the y-axis, 100 means you get 100% of the words correct, which is great. And at the bottom, 0 means you aren't getting any words correct. And then along the x-axis is time. From CAND just means candidacy, meaning just before the surgery. And then 1 month, 3 month, 6 month, 12 month, and 24 months after the surgery. The dotted orange line is the younger group, and the solid blue line is the older group. And you can see that the younger group does tend to do a little bit better, but by 24 months after, it's basically the same. The gap is closed. Skip this. This slide here shows usage of cochlear implants over time. This is measured in hours per day. So the usage is on the y-axis, going from 0 hours per day up to 18 hours per day. And again, the x-axis is time from just after surgery to 24 months after surgery. And again, the orange are the younger patients, and the blue is the older patients. And the younger patients did use the cochlear implant a little more, 13 hours versus 11 hours in the older group, but they're very close, and both groups are using the implants the majority of their waking hours, so that's obviously good. Now we'll get a little more complicated. So we can do this thing in statistics called multivariable regression, and maybe some people know what that is, but I'm going to assume most people don't. So that's a technique where we can look for predictors of an outcome. So an outcome is what you want, the hearing performance. So the outcome here is the AZ Bio score. Our goal is to figure out what is going to predict a good hearing outcome. So there are 5 predictors we looked at, and those are the rows here. Age, sex, duration of deafness, how much you use your cochlear implant, and how long you continue to see the audiologist after surgery. So the issue here is that you can't look at these predictors in isolation because of something we call confounding. So people who are older, they tend to have other issues. And so what we want to look at is isolating age and accounting for all the other issues. For example, people who are older, they might also have waited longer to have their cochlear implant, but your age and how long you wait before you decide to have your cochlear implant, those are 2 separate things. Not everyone who's older is a procrastinator. There are some older people that get their cochlear implants quickly after losing their hearing. So we can do this technique called multivariable regression, where we look at how much age predicts your hearing performance, but mathematically discounting all other things like how long you waited to have your surgery. And when we do that, we find that age is not a predictor of cochlear implant performance. That means that older people don't do worse, don't do better. They do the same as the younger people. So that's row 1, and that p-value all the way on the right is greater than 0.05. Just barely, but it's greater than 0.05. So I'm just going to say this one more time. What this means is that age does not predict how well you do with a cochlear implant if you control for everything else in the table. If you control for sex, duration of deafness, using your cochlear implant, and duration of follow-up. Now we go down to the second row. Sex is also not a predictor of how well you do with a cochlear implant if you control for age and duration of deafness and all the other stuff. And the purple rows, those are the ones that were the significant predictors. So duration of deafness, to no surprise, was definitely a predictor of how well you do with a cochlear implant if you take into account age, sex, cochlear implant usage, and duration of post-op follow-up. The fourth row, daily cochlear implant usage, that was also, to no surprise, a very good predictor of performance. The more you use your implant, the better you're going to do controlling for all the other stuff in the table. And then finally, duration of post-operative follow-up is also a significant predictor controlling for everything else. I hope that kind of makes sense. The point is, age doesn't predict how well you do with a cochlear implant. So some limitations of the study. Some of the data was entered after it already happened, what we call a retrospective data entry. That can introduce some error. But the main strength of the study was that it took data from many, many centers. So to the point where we wrote the study, it was in my opinion, the biggest and best study to this point. As I said 10 times on the previous slide, age did not predict surgical outcomes, including complications and hearing performance. In the last just minute or two, I'm going to change gears and just pontificate on how we might improve access to cochlear implant technology. So what are the barriers? And I think we're going to talk more about this in the open panel, so I'm just going to touch on it. I think fear is a big barrier, but the purpose of meetings like this is to make things transparent so you're aware of the very, very rare complications. It's honestly a very quick, easy, simple surgery, and we need to just get that knowledge out there to dispel the fear. I think lack of knowledge is also a major barrier, particularly in the broader medical community. Most internists don't really know much of anything about cochlear implants, and that needs to change. They've heard of heart surgery, they've heard of knee replacements, but they don't know what a cochlear implant is, and if you showed them a cochlear implant, they surely would have no idea how it worked. And I think another barrier is we need higher level data that cochlear implants help. There's a lot of data that show that cochlear implants allow you to hear better. I'm 100% sure they do. There's a lot of data that show you that it improves quality of life. I'm also sure that they do. What I think we really need to move the needle is show that cochlear implants do even more than that, and they affect what I call the hard medical outcomes, like lifespan, or your cognition, or depression. If you can prove that cochlear implants allow you to live a year or two longer, or they let your mind stay sharper for a few more years, I think that would really move the needle and affect payment and reimbursement, and it would get internists to recognize the power of cochlear implants, and that's kind of what some of the field is working on now. And I want to leave you with a final thought about the current practice in treating hearing loss. I think many in the audience recognize this, but it's always kind of poignant just to show it. Children, when they have hearing loss, they're generally treated. They're treated promptly and usually. But older adults, when they have hearing loss, they will procrastinate and they often don't get treated. By the way, this is my daughter 7 years ago on the left and my grandfather on his 90th birthday on the right. So when you have two groups of people who have the same condition but are treated vastly differently, what do we call that? We call that a disparity, and disparities are never right. So I think we all have to work hard to improve treatment in older adults. I love children, but I think older adults are just as important as children. And just to reiterate, cochlear implants, safe, effective in older adults. Age alone is not an impediment to getting an implant. And hearing loss is undertreated, and we all collectively need to do something about that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Golub. Now I'd like to call Candice Hobson to the podium to talk about her research, Disparities in Cochlear Implantation.
Good morning. Thank you, Christine, and thank you to the HLAA for having us out to speak today. My voice sounds okay. I hope it stays okay. I'm getting over something that is not COVID. So I'll be speaking this morning about disparities in cochlear implantation. And the reason this topic became of interest to me is that when I moved to Atlanta in 2019, the patient population was very different than what I'd seen in fellowship in San Diego or in residency in Pittsburgh, or even the 2 years I practiced in Pittsburgh. So in those 9 years altogether, I'd never implanted a black patient. So when I moved to Atlanta, I thought, for sure, with a city with such a large black population, I'll implant a black patient. But it wasn't until I was there for almost 8 or 9 months before I implanted my first black patient, and I thought, why is this? Am I imagining this? Is somebody else implanting them? And so we decided to look into it. Today's talk, though, we'll speak about more than just black and white race, and I'll share some other studies, but that's where this interest came from. So as it's been stated already, CI utilization rates in this country, I think, are low. So just under 13% of US adults who are likely to meet CI criteria actually have an implant. And that rate decreases to around 2% if you consider the expanded cochlear implant criteria, which are single-sided deafness and asymmetrical hearing loss, as was discussed earlier this morning. And so we know that there are certain patient populations that are at risk for low utilization of CI. And so we'll talk about those populations today. First are patients who live in rural areas, patients who are of non-white race, older patients, as was just discussed, and then patients with public insurance and, of course, with no insurance. Without insurance, you cannot get a cochlear implant unless you've got $100,000 to spend. And, of course, insurance type is a proxy for SE status. So geographic location. Approximately 20% of the U.S. population resides in rural areas. In a study out of Kentucky, looking at patients in rural Appalachia, Matt Bush out of the University of Kentucky found that patients who live in rural areas take about 5 years longer than patients in urban areas to get a hearing aid. And then when looking at cochlear implants, the difference was 7 years. 7 years longer for rural patients to proceed to cochlear implant surgery than patients living in urban areas. And those differences have an impact on patients' lives. Rural patients in their study were much more likely than urban patients to report losing their job because of troubles with their hearing. Rural patients also, on average, typically have lower levels of education, lower household incomes, and have to travel a greater distance to a CI center. And the reason for that, of course, is that many CI centers, like much of medical care, they typically exist in urban areas, in large cities. Oops. And so why is it difficult for these rural patients to come to a city, come to Atlanta, come to Miami, go to New York for their hearing aids? Well, it takes a lot for them to get there, and they tend to miss appointments, understandably. And so it takes money to travel, and so you have to pay for gas, which these days is much more than in the past, but was already a challenge to begin with. For many of us, when you go to the doctor and you live in a big city, you can take a half day off work, or for me, I just go downstairs in the building. I don't have to leave, so you miss a half day or you miss a couple hours. But when you live 2 or 3 hours from your doctor's office, it's a whole day. If you live 4 hours, it can be 2 days. You travel, you stay overnight, you go home the next day. And so then that also introduces the cost of a hotel. And then you have to have a car to get there, or maybe you share a family car. And so it can be really difficult for these patients to make it to their appointments. And it's not just one appointment. You have to have an appointment to meet the audiologist, to have your cochlear implant evaluation to see if you meet criteria, to choose a device, to meet the surgeon, to have your imaging, to have pre-op testing, maybe meet with the anesthesia doctor. And then there's all of the visits after the implant, seeing the doctor to check, the surgeon to check the incision, meeting with audiology periodically for programming visits to see how you're doing and make adjustments. That can be up to 10 appointments from the time of the initial consultation till you come back for your 1-year follow-up. And so this is a large study conducted out of Mayo, but they looked at 7 large cochlear implant centers across the U.S. And they found that the vast majority of cochlear implant patients lived within 100 miles of a CI center, and 91% within 200 miles of the CI center. And so, of course, a greater distance to the CI center was associated with older age at the time of cochlear implantation. And then naturally, if you lived a greater distance, you were more likely to reside in a rural area because, again, these CI centers are typically in big cities. Race, and so the topic that brought me to looking into disparities. The first study we'll look at is a study out of UT Southwestern in Dallas, a large CI center. Over a 9-year period, they took a look at the demographics of their cochlear implant patients, and they found that around 90% of their cochlear implant patients were white, non-Hispanic, and English-speaking. And this was not reflective of the population of the Dallas-Fort Worth area, which is just 47% white, 71% non-Hispanic, and 68% English-speaking. In this study, they found that non-white patients were half as likely than white patients to pursue cochlear implant surgery. And there can be a number of reasons for that, and it's difficult to assess that in a retrospective study. But we see that not just in cochlear implant surgery, we see that across other surgical fields where Black or Hispanic patients are less likely to pursue surgery or to pursue technology than white patients. In this study, they also found that older patients were less likely than younger patients to pursue surgery, but that difference wasn't as big as the difference with race. And so last year, or 2 years ago, we published out of Emory a study looking at the racial breakdown of our cochlear implant patients, both patients presenting for a cochlear implant evaluation, and so testing to see if they are candidates for cochlear implant, and also patients who underwent cochlear implant surgery. And the numbers for patients undergoing evaluation and surgery are similar, and so I have on this slide the CI evaluation patients. And so about 20% of the patients in our practice who presented for CI evaluation who underwent cochlear implant surgery were Black. That's much less than what we expected based on the local population demographics. The city of Atlanta is about 51% Black, and then when we look at Emory's primary service area, which extends beyond the boundaries of the city, it's about 42% Black. So Black patients were underrepresented. When we looked at white patients or even Asian patients, they were overrepresented compared to what we expect based off their representation in the local populations. So almost 70% of the patients in our practice who presented for CI evaluation or surgery were white. But Atlanta is only about 40% white, and Emory's primary service area is about 46 or 47% white race. We also found that there were differences in the hearing abilities in patients when they presented for cochlear implant evaluation. So Black patients had significantly worse hearing than white or Asian patients on standard audiogram, so a conventional hearing test. And that p-value to the right is what Dr. Golub was just discussing, so less than 0.05 is considered statistically significant. And so Black patients heard on average worse than white or Asian patients, requiring louder volumes to hear pure tones on standard hearing tests. On aided sentence testing, so these are those AZ-BIOS sentences, Black patients also performed significantly worse than white or Asian patients. And so they're presenting with worse hearing at the time of cochlear implant evaluation. And then this is just a summary slide, but what I want to point out on this slide, different from the study out of UT Southwestern, we found that our Black CI candidates pursued cochlear implant surgery at rates similar to white CI candidates. And so it's just a matter of getting them into the door for testing in that surgical discussion. This is a study out of MUSC, South Carolina, a similar finding to ours in that non-white patients had worse hearing at the time of CI evaluation. But what's interesting, and I'm not sure how to explain, is that non-white patients were younger than white patients at the time of CI evaluation. And then the last point I think we can understand, they were less likely to have hearing aids. Hearing aids are costly. They also found that increased age was associated with a delay in cochlear implantation, but that difference was small. And then the last topic we'll touch on is insurance, specifically looking at Medicaid insurance. For pediatric patients, Medicaid as well as private insurance typically covers the cost of cochlear implantation. For adults, however, only about 60% of states offer Medicaid coverage for cochlear implantation. In the state of Georgia, where I practice, Medicaid does not cover adult CI. And so if you're under the age of 65 and you don't have Medicare or private insurance, you can't get a cochlear implant. Actually, in our office, you can't even have a hearing test. They have to go to the public hospital for a hearing test. We also see in our practice young adults, so people who are 20 years old, 23 years old, who have aged out of their Medicaid insurance, but who were implanted when they were younger and had Medicaid coverage for implant. And these patients come in with their processors taped together and not working. And we can't help them because Medicaid does not cover the implant once they age out. And then it's also worth noting that non-white patients and minority ethnic groups are more likely to have public insurance than white patients, so more likely to have Medicaid. And so that makes them more likely to be affected by this disparity. And then even when Medicaid does cover cochlear implantation, it presents a challenge. It can be difficult for patients to find a facility that accepts their insurance. Medicaid can limit the number of covered appointments. It can be difficult to obtain replacement or upgraded equipment. It's difficult to get authorizations for care. It just really presents a challenge for our offices and hospitals to get Medicaid to reimburse and to approve care for these patients. And then you should know if you have Medicare insurance, you can't just have Medicare Part A. You have to have the Part B or Part C supplement to cover the device itself. Part A will cover the surgery, but you can't have the surgery without getting the device. And so other things to think about, and it's already been discussed, unlike cancer or heart disease or diabetes, there's no standard screening for hearing loss. And we know 80% of people over 80 have hearing loss, but the primary care doctor is not obligated, it's not on their checklist to say, hey, we need to send you for a hearing test. And then there's no standard audiological screening for cochlear implantation. And so really it's dependent on the practice patterns of the primary care doctor or the ENT physician or the audiologist to say, hey, I think we need to get you a hearing test, or hey, you might be a candidate for cochlear implantation, let's send you for testing. And so that creates opportunities for bias, and it also can exacerbate disparity. Many savvy patients, educated patients, can know to ask about cochlear implantation, and that's all of you in the audience. But many people have never even heard of it, and unfortunately think of hearing loss as just an inconsequential part of aging, and it's not inconsequential. In 2020, the group out of Michigan with Terry Zwolen recommended a screening guideline for cochlear implantation. And so they recommend a 60-60 rule. So if your pure tone average, so the hearing volume level on your hearing test is greater than or equal to 60, or if you're scoring less than 60% word recognition on a standard hearing test, you should be sent to see if you meet criteria for cochlear implantation. And with this, they catch about 96% of candidates and then have about a 34% false positive rate. But we'd rather have one in the office to watch to see when they do meet criteria than to miss out on patients who should be having an implant. And so how can we improve access? I think first we have to increase awareness and reduce misconceptions about cochlear implantation. And these topics have been mentioned today. Patients come into our office and they think that cochlear implantation is brain surgery. It's not brain surgery. It's not supposed to be, at least, unless you get one of those complications of a CSF leak, but that's rare. So it's not brain surgery. It's not experimental. That's a question we get from time to time. I get that more at the VA than I do at Emory. I spend a day a week at the VA, but it's not experimental. You're not a guinea pig, and I think that's unfortunately an attitude of veterans, understandably. Residual hearing. People worry about losing what hearing they have left. In many cases, there's not much left to lose. But in some cases, there's hearing that can be preserved. But with advances in technology and advances in surgical technique, we can often preserve hearing. It's not a guarantee, but it's possible. And so we need to increase the awareness among the general population so that you guys spread the word, among audiologists and among primary care physicians. I think it'd be great if we had standardized CI referral guidelines, or even standardized guidelines for testing standard audiometry for patients, especially in a geriatric practice. And so I think it's important for all of us to keep in the back of our mind the 60-60 rule. It's not official, but I think if you just say, 60-60, my hearing volume is greater than 60, I'm getting less than 60% of these words correct, let's see if I meet criteria for cochlear implantation. And then lastly, it'd be great if we could expand access to CI services, and I think this is the hardest challenge to overcome. There's a lot of barriers. Georgia does not have Medicaid coverage for cochlear implantation. They did at some point, I think it was over 10 years ago, and how to fix that, I'm not sure. We are working on it. I've had conversations with the Georgia Society of Otolaryngology about what we can do to lobby for coverage. I think we're a ways off, but it's on our minds. And in the meantime, we're working to see what we can do to increase our knowledge about the disparities. And so right now we have a second study looking at our Medicaid patients or the non-insured patients at Grady to see who we're missing. How many people are missing out on implant that could have one? And then lastly, extending coverage in the use of telemedicine. And so this is for those patients in rural areas. This is being practiced at some institutions, but certainly you can utilize telemedicine with a remote audiologist to perform a CI evaluation or programming visits or counseling visits when patients choose a device. They shouldn't have to make 10 trips into the big city. That is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hobson. So I will be giving the last talk of this series before we go into our panel discussion, and my talk is called Hearing Preservation in Cochlear Implantation. I have no relevant financial disclosures, but some of the research that I will be presenting in this talk was funded over the years by Advanced Bionics, MED-EL, and the American Research Foundation, to my colleagues. So the objective of my talk is to answer a couple of questions. What is residual hearing when it comes to cochlear implantation? Why is it important to preserve it? What causes the loss of residual hearing? And what are ways in which we can preserve it? So here again, you see a plot of an audiogram where we put the results of a conventional hearing test, and from left to right, we plot low pitches to high pitches, and from up to down, we plot good hearing to poor hearing. What you see in the red circles are results for a right ear. What you see in the blue X's are the results for the left ear. And this is a very common result that we see for hearing loss, where patients have really good low frequency hearing, but very poor high frequency hearing. And sometimes we can give patients a hearing aid to increase the volume, and that can restore their ability to hear and understand words and sentences. But sometimes the hearing is too far gone that even if we give a hearing aid, it won't restore the understanding of speech. And in those patients, we can treat them with a cochlear implant that restores hearing in the mid to high frequencies. And if we're able to save the low frequency natural residual hearing, we can provide them with a hearing aid to amplify the low frequencies. So with the hearing aid and with a cochlear implant on the same side, a patient can hear in a manner that we call electroacoustic hearing, hearing with the implant and hearing with the hearing aid. So why is it important to preserve that low frequency natural hearing? Well, sound awareness without the implant. So if you're sleeping and you don't have the implants on, you can still hear the fire alarm or the smoke detector, and this is important for safety. People with residual hearing that use a cochlear implant can understand speech better in more challenging environments like noise, like going to a restaurant or going to the grocery store or having dinner with the family. People with residual hearing can also hear music better. They can hear tones and pitches, and that may be also important for tonal languages like Mandarin. So what causes loss of residual hearing? Well, progression from natural causes, Well, before the surgery, if you are having hearing loss that was slowly declining with time, it may continue to decline after the cochlear implant surgery from natural causes. We can lose our residual hearing if the implant is placed and injures some of the microanatomy of the cochlea, and then that can lead to inflammation and loss of residual hearing. A cochlear implant is a foreign body, and our body may treat it as foreign, creating inflammation to wall it off, and that inflammation can also cause loss of residual hearing. After surgery, or any surgery, patients will initiate a healing process that produces inflammation and creates scar tissue to heal the wound. And this process has a lot of inflammatory processes that can also cause you to lose your residual hearing. So there are a lot of things that we can't, there are some things that we can't prevent, like the progression from natural causes. But there are a lot of things that we can do to prevent loss of residual hearing, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So how can we reduce injury to the cochlea? What you see here is a diagram of the cochlea, and if you look inside the cochlea has several different channels called the scala tympani, the scala media, and the scala vestibuli. And at the center of one of those turns is the organ of Corti. And the organ of Corti has cells in it called the outer and inner hair cells. And these are important for residual hearing. In the most perfect world, when we do a surgery for cochlear implantation, we want the implant to sit in the scala tympani, close to the organ of Corti, close to the cochlear nerve, to be able to stimulate those structures and help people hear. But sometimes the implant doesn't fit the cochlea right, and when we put the implant in during surgery, it can displace and injure the cochlear nerve, injure the auditory hair cells, translocate into the scala vestibuli, injure the blood supply of the cochlea, and cause a lot of inflammation that causes those cells that are important for hearing to die, and we can lose our residual hearing. On top of that, when there's injury to the cochlea, our body will naturally want to produce scar tissue. It can also cause the cochlea to produce more bone, and this will cause loss of residual hearing and can also affect implant performance. So how can we reduce injury to the cochlea? There are many researchers all over the world looking at different designs for the cochlear implant electrode array, the part that goes into the cochlea, looking at different designs that can reduce injury to the cochlea. There has been amazing advances in the past 10 years. There are perimedullary array designs, which are closer to the center of the cochlea, called the medullus. In the past, they used to be very large, they used to be very rigid and cause a lot of injury, but nowadays, there are designs that are thinner, less rigid, and we're able to get this implant very close to the cochlear nerve to stimulate it without causing any injury. There are lateral wall array designs that kind of sit a little bit farther from the center of the cochlea. They are very thin, they are very pliable, and as a result, when inserted correctly, can reduce the injury to the cochlea and help us preserve our residual or natural hearing. There are some people that are looking at a design that's kind of somewhere in between the perimedullary and the lateral wall, and that's called a mid-scalar array design. They're generally pre-curved, they're very thin, but if it doesn't touch the center of the cochlea and it doesn't touch the farther wall of the cochlea, you can potentially reduce injury to the cochlea and protect your residual hearing. And there are hybrid array designs. If you have really good low frequency hearing, we can just insert a shorter cochlear implant, which causes less damage and less loss of residual hearing. So there are many different designs that people have come up with over the past 10 years that have really changed our ability to preserve hearing. There are other things that researchers have been looking at too, such as robotic-assisted cochlear implantation. Hopefully in the future, in the next couple of years, you may see people working more with robots to be able to insert the cochlear implant, potentially causing less injury to the cochlea than maybe human error. That's still to be proven. We can do real-time electrocochleography where we're measuring the cochlear health throughout the entire cochlear implant surgery. And the surgeon can then implant the cochlear implant, listening to this device and monitoring how they put in the implant to reduce the injury to the cochlea so we can save your natural hearing. There are other researchers that have created hypothermia probes that really cool down the cochlea, which really reduces the inflammation that may occur immediately after or later on after the surgery. And many people worldwide have been looking at otoprotective medications that we can apply to the cochlea to reduce the injury and protect your residual hearing. So what causes our auditory hair cells to die and for us to lose our residual hearing during cochlear implant surgery? When I was a medical student, I joined the laboratory of Thomas van der Water, an inner ear biologist. And later on, we were joined by a basic scientist, Dr. Esperanza Bass. And we were really doing many different experiments looking at trying to understand how auditory hair cells implode and explode and then ultimately die off. So that way we can understand what pathways we can block to be able to protect our hair cells from dying off. And we tried many different drugs and we were able to block different pathways and protect our auditory hair cells. But we soon realized that it wasn't enough, not enough to protect the residual hearing during and after cochlear implant surgery. And what we realized was if we are able to block the inflammation that led to these cells, to start the death pathway and ultimately die off, we can be more effective at saving your natural and your residual hearing. And this process is very complex. It involves multiple cells, multiple proteins, growth factors, chemokines, cytokines. But we've spent a lot of time looking at understanding how this pathway forms and how this pathway affects residual hearing to ultimately be able to find ways to block it. So how do we preserve your residual hearing? Well, the answer is, how do we block inflammation? So in the 2000s, several labs across the United States and the world were looking at corticosteroids, applying them locally, orally, intravenously, to be able to reduce the inflammation that causes our hair cells to die off. And if we're able to do that, we can protect the auditory hair cells and also prevent some of that scar tissue and new bone formation that forms around the implant after we do the surgery. And that can also affect the residual hearing. So in my lab, we've been studying a drug called Dexamethasone, and it's a type of steroids. There are different types of steroids. But we show on a lot of different experiments that we've published over the years that dexamethasone is protective against inflammation and the type of inflammation that causes the auditory hair cells to die off. And we were so lucky and grateful that Meadow, one of the cochlear implant companies, approached our laboratory and said, look, we'd love for you to participate in this international effort to create a new cochlear implant that is able to deliver dexamethasone into the cochlea over weeks to months to protect somebody's residual hearing and to prevent scar tissue from forming. And so our effort, contribution to this project is really the cumulative effort of many different scientists, including Esperanza Bass, who headed a lot of the experiments that were conducted at the University of Miami. And I'm going to show you some results of the more important results that we found in our study. And so we did a study on guinea pigs in which we put a cochlear implant in their cochlea, and when we did that, it actually caused them to lose 50% of their hearing from the inflammatory process. But if we implanted a cochlear implant that was slowly releasing this dexamethasone into the cochlea, we can protect some of that residual hearing. And the more dexamethasone we apply to the cochlea, the more we can protect that natural hearing to a point where when we delivered a high level of dexamethasone steroid, the hearing was no different than that of a normal cochlea. So these were amazing findings that we saw at different frequencies, at 4, at 16, at 8, and that led MED-EL to continue this research in non-human primates and further. We also looked into the cochlea to see, well, did we save our hair cells? Did we save our cochlear nerve? And when you look at a guinea pig cochlea with a cochlear implant without any steroid, we actually don't see a lot of the auditory hair cells we wanted to save, and we don't see a lot of the nerve fibers that we wanted to preserve. But when we implanted with a cochlear implant that slowly delivered steroid over the next couple of weeks, we were actually able to preserve a lot of the auditory hair cells that are important for residual hearing, and that's what you see in green. And we're able to preserve a lot of the nerve fibers, and that's what you see kind of in the stringy yellow-orange. So we are lucky to be part of this 20-decade international research effort that led to, on June 30th, 2020, the implantation of the first dexamethasone-eluting cochlear implant in Germany. And this is just an amazing thing to be a part of, because a lot of times creating a device like this takes more than 20 years, can take half a lifetime. And so we were able to do it within 20 years. And hopefully in the next couple of months, we're going to see the outcomes of these 10 patients that were implanted with the Dex-L cochlear implant. And hopefully in the next 5 years, we can bring that to you. So what's new? What's next? And so other researchers are looking into new designs called optical cochlear implants. Instead of delivering electricity to the cochlea, we can deliver infrared light to these nerve fibers and hopefully increase resolution of hearing for patients with cochlear implants. We can apply new biological compounds to stimulate nerve growth and improve resolution of the cochlear implants. It is a great time really now to really explore cochlear implantation. So I'm going to end with a couple of preliminary results from my laboratory that I find are just so amazing that I want to share with you. So normally, the cochlear nerve innervates the auditory hair cells, and that's how we hear. And the cochlear implant delivers electricity to that nerve to allow us to hear. But that process is not very refined. And so that's where laminin comes into place. Laminin is a type of protein that exists all over our body. It's natural to us, it's natural to mammals. But what's important about this protein is that it protects the neurons in our body. It also stimulates them to grow. So if we could develop a cochlear implant that is coated in laminin, we can stimulate the cochlear nerve fibers to grow toward this implant and help you hear better and refine the process of hearing with cochlear implantation. So we cultured cochlear neurons on a dish without laminin and with laminin, and we followed them over the next couple of days, and we are able to see without laminin that these neurons really don't go anywhere. They kind of hover in the same place, and those neurons are what you see in green. But when we add laminin close by, we can stimulate these nerves to grow toward our target in a very uniform fashion. And so you can see the strings of cochlear neurons growing toward the laminin, toward the bottom of the screen. We also know that if we apply laminin, we can preserve a lot of those nerves, and we can actually promote their cell alignment and organization. And this is amazing because sometimes hearing loss happens because people don't have a lot of cochlear nerve fibers. But if we can stimulate them to grow, we can really improve outcomes for people with cochlear implants. And lastly, we cultured that organ of Corti that I talked about earlier on a dish. And without any laminin, you can see in the green, those little stringy things, that the nerves kind of hovered close to the organ. But if we were culture them with laminin close by, we can stimulate those nerves to grow out from the organ toward our target. So these are amazing results, and hopefully we will continue it on. And in the next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, hopefully we can get something to you that is amazing and improves the resolution of the cochlear implant. I'd like to acknowledge the amazing people that I work with that constantly strive for excellence to find new ways to improve outcomes for our patients. I could not do what I do without the University of Miami Cochlear Implant Program that delivers clinical excellence to our patients with hearing loss, and my supportive department and institution. Thank you to the HLAA and Roxana Rotunda for allowing all of us to come today to talk about our passion for treating patients with hearing loss and for talking about cochlear implants. And so I'd like now to invite the panelists to the stage and Roxana to the podium because we have some questions that we'd like to answer for you, questions that our patients normally have for their physicians and audiologists.
Wow, there's a lot of light here. Hello, everyone. I'm part of the Research Symposium Committee, along with Dr. Jan Blumstein, who could not be with us today. And I can say that we are very, very proud in HLAA of this talented and diverse panel that we put together today. So please, a big applause for the 4 of them. First, the most important thing, we want to thank you for speaking in a way that we could understand you, okay? Because in most of these research symposiums, it's hard to understand the medical term, and you make it so easy for us to understand it. Second, thank you to Dr. Martinez to make my friends in HLAA understand why I prefer to speak Spanish instead of English. Even though I love English, it's easier for me to hear Spanish. So I'm going to start with the questions. The first thing is technology. We know that technology is growing, and improving so fast. And many people here that are candidate ask, should I wait for a better CI to come? Should I wait for a more advanced cochlear implants to be invented in the next year? In my personal case, I waited 7 years to get the CI, and I regretted so much why I didn't do it sooner. But I would like your medical opinion about it.
I'm going to start off, and maybe one of the other panelists can chime in. But cochlear implants have evolved so much over the past decade, 2 decades, and they function amazing to a point that they're restoring hearing and speech understanding to a lot of our patients. And even though I talked a lot about new designs that are upcoming, those take a long time to reach our patients. Sometimes it takes a decade, sometimes it takes 2 decades, and I told you sometimes it takes half a lifetime. And so nowadays the cochlear implant technology is so amazing that I feel that if it is the time, if you're wearing your hearing aid and you're not hearing your family, you're not hearing your friends, now is the time to do it, because cochlear implantation right now is at its peak.
Yeah, I'd also like to add on to that, Dr. Dinh, and talk about, just briefly, the point of duration of deafness. And so the longer that someone is off the air and they're not getting their auditory nerve stimulated, it could actually impact how you do later with the cochlear implant. So sooner is actually better. And while we never want to force anybody into getting the cochlear implant, the time is of the essence. But at the same time, you do have to be ready mentally.
Those are great comments. Another important comment is that most of the technological improvements over time happen through software and the external device. The implant, the part that we put in with surgery that is very difficult to ever change or upgrade, although it can be done, that has been pretty static for the past decade or so. There have been some minor refinements in the electrodes, but for the most part, the brains of the device is really the external part, and that is typically going to be upgraded every 5 years, just like a hearing aid is upgraded or changed over about every 5 years.
And then I'll just add one last comment. People do really well with implants as they are currently. And so there are patients, many patients, who achieve 88, 90% speech understanding, and I think that's pretty hard to beat. Some patients even 100.
Thank you. So in conclusion, we don't wait. Okay. The second question will be expectation versus reality. You closed the last part talking about remaining hearing, which I think is one of the most worrisome part of the surgery. So how do people manage expectation? In my personal case, I help a lot of candidates to go into the process of the surgery, and I always prepare them for the worst case scenario, which I think is the best, because if you get an remaining hearing, it will be so good for you to celebrate it. So how did you as doctors prepare them for the worst?
I can start. When I have a patient that is interested in cochlear implants, we talk through the entire process. We talk about the worst case scenario. We talk about the best case scenario. And it's really hard to predict sometimes how a person's going to respond if they've been deaf already and if they've waited 10 to 20 to 30 years to get their implant. But we know that the brain is a very powerful organ, and if we work at it, if you work at using a cochlear implant, you can achieve results that are really amazing for your life, for your quality of life, and for your daily activities. And so, just being realistic with your patient puts them really at ease that if something were to happen, we could help them get through it.
Yeah, I would have to echo Dr. Dinh on that. And I think as an audiologist, part of the cochlear implant team, it is our job to prep the patient and get them ready with those realistic expectations. And sometimes it doesn't necessarily sink in on the first visit. It takes a few times, to kind of hear the same message over and over to sort of understand. You don't really understand until you actually have the device and it's on and working for you. But I will give you a little bit of sort of behind the scenes tidbit is that as an audiologist, I know for us and our team, we actually would paint a little bit of shade of gloom and doom. Not that it was going to be bad, but we also had to be very realistic. And so, so for example, on the first day for the initial activation, you're not going to be walking out the door talking on the phone, typically. Rather, you would, if you can hear me knocking on the table, if you can hear me doing pop, pop, pop for the day one, we're doing good. So, yes, you need to be mentally prepared and have realistic expectations, but the professional also has to do their part and get you ready as well.
I agree with all that. We try in cochlear implant surgery to under-promise and over-deliver. Of course, I probably shouldn't have told you that and just say that we under-promise. But one of the things that I always focus on is the activation. A lot of people have great expectations for activation. They're looking forward to it. They fixate on the one moment when finally the device is turned on and you can hear again. And that appointment is just one tiny little step in the multi-year journey of learning how to hear with this new device. And so I always try to explain that your activation experience, we have no idea what it will be like. You may love it, you may hate it, you may be alarmed by how the sound is, but the most important thing is just to, when you walk out of the office, discard it and just keep the device on your head and wear it as much as you can, because it's really one of the things you can control the most is your usage after that activation appointment. That's going to influence your long-term results. So we always say don't fixate too much on that one activation experience.
So I agree. I think we also typically, not quite doom and gloom, but let the patients know that they can expect some hearing loss after the implantation, and if we're lucky, we'll save some hearing. But even in cases where we're not able to preserve hearing, the patient's natural hearing, they're still gaining a lot of hearing. So that implant, most of the electrodes that we use, will stimulate the cochlea at all of the frequencies. And so there's going to be a net gain in the end almost all of the time.
Thank you. Well, you have a room here full of hearing loss advocates who do a lot of work on the ground and help people with hearing loss. So my last question would be, what do you think we can do as advocates to make your work easier and better and help more people, because the statistic of people getting CI is really low. It's a percentage that we could be helping so many people. So what do you think? See how I use my hands, and maybe that's what the result is different. So what do you think we can do as advocates to help you get the message that this surgery and this technology is safe? And in my personal case, it changed my life. It gave my life so much good things. How do we do that?
Well, I think that you're doing a lot of that right now, Roxana, just coming to these meetings and learning about cochlear implants and spreading the word to other patients that may be thinking about cochlear implants. And I think other people have mentioned in their talk about the importance of educating the community and going out and talking to the physicians, the internists, the primary care physicians, the audiologist, and creating a 60-60 rule that just helps facilitate patients to get cochlear implants when they need it.
Yeah, during my time at the University of Miami, we were very lucky to have some patients on board who were willing to speak to other potential patients. So if they had a hearing aid and they needed to talk to someone who had a hearing aid to share their experiences, or same thing with someone who was looking to get a cochlear implant, and we would connect them with somebody, one of our patients, who would answer their questions. So things like that is very helpful as well.
We had some here that we did that and it helped. So Margaret, yeah, that was her case. Thank you.
Yay, Margaret.
Hi, Margaret.
I would say that keep doing what you're doing, keep working on outreach and spreading the word about hearing loss and the importance of treating hearing and the importance of hearing through whatever avenues you can, whether it's social media or networking with politicians or lobbying on the Hill or speaking to other providers. I think it needs to be a very multi-pronged attack. We kind of need to permeate the air throughout the world about the importance of hearing loss, and that just takes massive continual effort.
I don't think I have much more to add. I think what you're doing is exactly what we want from our patients and is exactly what our CI candidates ask for. So many of our patients will say, is there somebody I can speak to who's had an implant so I can understand what things sound like, what the post-op experience was like, just what can I expect? And so I think just being available. We don't always, as surgeons, ask our patients, hey, would you be willing? And we don't think about it until after the patient's left the office. You see the next patient and they say, hey, is there somebody I could speak to? And you think, oh, I should have just asked the last person I saw. And so you can help us to remind us, say, hey, I'm available if you have anybody that would like to speak to someone. I'm happy to do it.
Thank you. And I always give a lot of positivism to the process, which I think it helps more than 50% to make it successful. So I'm going to let Dr. Dinh close this symposium. We're going to be showing tomorrow the complete documentary here at 4:30 p.m. and we'll be happy to share with you any questions after. So go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Roxana. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us. Please, on behalf of the symposium team, please fill out the survey. There are 2 ways to do that. You can complete the survey through the convention app. You can click on the link in the email that we'll send you after the convention, but your feedback is important so we could do what we need to do to provide you the information you need to treat your hearing loss. And I also wanted to say that we have 2 educational workshops in Tampa Bay Room 1 on cochlear implantation, especially if you have questions and you want to talk to us more face-to-face. We have one with the surgeons at 1:15, and we have one with Roxana and Dr. Martinez, our audiologist, about the patient experience at 2:30. Please come and join us. I hope you guys enjoyed the rest of your day. Thank you.